So first of all, you guys have turned in your papers about Kant, I hope. Are there any questions about Kantian ethics or Kant stuff before we move on to something new? Is everybody comfortable with Kant and his deal? Sorta, mostly. Um, he's really tough to read, but his ideas aren't that complicated. I don't think they're not that crazy. So hopefully we were able to get that with some guidance. We're going to today talk about a slightly different theory, but one that's actually very closely related to Kant. It was sort of a natural next step, I think, from out of Kant's theories, and that's the idea of rights, moral rights, using a theory of rights to determine what is right and what is wrong. And remember that all of these systems that we've been using, right? We go back to egoism and utilitarianism and Kant and now moral rights. The whole point of this activity, the whole point of these discussions is so that we have a tool to determine whether an action is right or wrong, right? So that we can judge appropriate behavior in a given circumstance. So, and I bring that up because as I've been reading some of your utilitarian papers about the baker and the blacksmith and the ones who walk away from Omelas, right? What I've seen is that people are kind of saying, yeah, I disagree with that, or I don't, or I do agree. Like, yeah, Omelas is a great town. Too bad for that little kid. But the idea is that we're supposed to be using, right? It's not necessarily. I don't want to know what you think in that circumstance. I mean, I do in class want to know what you think, but like, it's not a question of does this fit in with my theories that I came into class with or my feelings about stuff. This is why we spent some time getting rid of the whole religious argument sort of thing, because the question is not how does this strike you, right? Because presumably it strikes you as pretty terrible. Some of the things like the baker and blacksmith example. That's not the question. The question is, does utilitarianism say that this is right or wrong, right? And so your answer there should be, well, whatever your answer should be. It's nuanced, right? It's complicated, right? The immediate thought is, yes, that's exactly what utilitarianism says. And then the follow-up is, well, that's probably not what utilitarianism says. And you can use that feeling of, well, this feels wrong to help motivate your response, to guide your response. Like utilitarianism says this is right, but it feels so wrong that there's got to be something more complicated going on here. And that you can use that as a driving force, but that can't be your final answer. Can't just say, oh, it just doesn't seem right. That's not what I'm asking. Right? I'm asking, what does utilitarianism say? How do we use utility to determine right versus wrong? Well, we use the greatest good for the greatest number, and that's going to give us our answer regarding a certain activity. And then Kant is going to give us maybe a different answer, right, based on when we use his criteria. I mean, if we use Kant and we look at that city, right, the town of Omelas, what is Kant going to say about Omelas? It's unacceptable. Yeah, it's not morally right. Why?
Because the child is a means.
Exactly. Child is being used merely as a means to the end of prosperity in the city, and that's unacceptable. Even if it's just one child, one person, that's unacceptable, right? What's that? That's right, because everybody is equal, and there's no such thing as, right, the many outweighing the one. If any one person is being inappropriately treated, all bets are off. That's not okay. Right? So we see that these different systems give us different answers to the same problem, and that's good, right? As long as we can see that. Rights theory also helps us to determine what is right and what is wrong. And you've probably heard of, and we have to be careful, this stupid word right in English is like the worst, right? Like R-I-G-H-T, it means so many different things. That's not even getting into the homophone right, like I write with a pen, right? That's a different thing. But right, like right versus left, right versus wrong. I'm going to go right there. I have rights. I'm standing right next to you, right? Right, meaning correct. There are like 35 meanings of the word right, which is really annoying. So we have to be careful when we use that word in this class, that we're all talking about the same thing when we talk about the word right. We are not talking about right like that is, it's right to do that, right? As in correct, or even good to, like morally correct, right? That's not what we mean by right here. We mean one's rights, as we have heard, as in the Bill of Rights, those sorts of rights, right? And we have different kinds of rights, and they can help us to figure out whether or not something is, I'm not going to say right, I'm going to say appropriate, right, or correct. The basics. So this starts in the 17th century. People they're using Kant's theory, and they're starting to think about people as sort of these unique individual entities that need protecting sometimes from people who have power, and so the Enlightenment starts to head in this direction, really kind of following Kant. And then we get in the 18th century, when all of the revolutions, or the social revolutions in the United States, in France, these things are happening, and people are writing these like declarations of new governments. Right? They're sort of establishing these new governments. This idea of rights starts to be developed a little bit more thoroughly, and we get this guy John Locke. John Locke, who you might remember from your American history classes. He was pretty significantly involved in a lot of the thought processes that people like Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine were pulling ideas from in the creation of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and so on, and particularly the Bill of Rights. John Locke really develops this idea of human rights as a theory that needs to be that can help us to determine what is appropriate action. And it kind of boils down to this idea that individual persons are valuable, and we should act in ways that respect their value. Right? That's sort of what's at the core of the idea of human rights. Right? Human individuals are valuable, which of course should remind us an awful lot of our friend Kant, right, and his thoughts about human beings being ends unto themselves, right? They are, each human is an end. And so in that way, each person is valuable, and we should respect that value, right? He referred to what kind of value. Each person has intrinsic value, that's right, not instrumental value, or at least not just instrumental value, right? Intrinsic value in and of himself, each person. And notice, this is individual persons without any qualifications. It doesn't matter what kind of person, or gender, or wealth, or anything, socioeconomic status. It's just people are valuable. And we should act in ways that respect their value. And these essentially are what produce what we call natural rights. These are rights that are given to us by nature. They are sometimes called human rights because they are things that we possess by virtue of being human. Right? Every human being, at least in theory, has human rights, the rights that are established as part of that person being human. Yes? All this makes sense so far. Pretty straightforward. We have to be careful, though, and we're going to talk about this in a second. There are different kinds of rights, and they're not every right that you think of is a human right. Right? There are different ways that you can achieve rights. Some of them just by being born. Others come from other sources. We've talked about this descriptive versus normative sort of conflict, not conflict, but at least distinction before. We used, when we were talking about psychological egoism versus ethical egoism, right? We talked a little bit about, basically, psychological egoism is a descriptive theory. It describes the way the world is. And then ethical egoism is a normative or prescriptive theory that describes the way things ought to be. Similarly, we have this sort of different way of approaching human rights. One way of looking at it is, as in a descriptive way, we are born humans, and therefore we have human rights, or natural rights. Another way of approaching it is a normative. We ought to have these rights because we are human. Right? It sounds like might sound a lot like the same thing, but they're not exactly the same. One is about just a statement of fact. The other one has an ought built into it, which suggests that we aren't necessarily just born with them, but they are granted to us by virtue of being humans. Yes? It's a fine distinction, and maybe not super important here, but I just wanted to make sure that we understand that there is a distinction between the two sort of approaches to human rights. At the end of the day, they kind of come out to the same thing. Right? But it's important that we see that there are different ways of looking at human rights. I mean, I think that there's this assumption, particularly for people who live in the United States, that rights are just like a thing. Yeah, everybody's got rights. We've all got certain rights, right? And we can all talk about. We've all heard the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness stuff, right, at some point. And so we just kind of assume those things exist. But there are other places in the world where that is not the assumption. That's not the default. And of course, even in America, it's not super clear that everybody actually has those rights, is afforded those rights. So it's a sort of immediate assumption, yeah, of course, but in reality, it's not always that easy or that straightforward. Right? I mean, our friend, remember Ayn Rand, inventor of objectivism, she came to the United States from Russia, and she actually called the United States the first moral country in the world because she believed that the United States, more than any other country ever had before, established these idea of rights, right? Recognized human rights and defended them, protected them in a way that no other country had ever done, right? And that was why she loved this country so much. She believed these rights were valuable. Now, she didn't think that those were enough, which is why she went on to talk about this objectivism as a way to determine the right behavior. But she thought at least that fundamental existence of rights was something that the United States had going for it, and that ideal, which is what, right, again, why we often, as American citizens, often think like, oh yeah, of course, rights, but it's not like that everywhere. So we've got natural rights, sometimes called human rights, which you get just by being born, being human, right? Assuming you are born human. Right? And we can get into all sorts of discussions about what it means to be a human, right? Because that's complicated too, even though that might not seem to be, right? Like, what does it used to be a long time ago? What did it mean to be human? Well, you had to be born in the right shape, right, without any significant weirdnesses, right? If you were born disabled or malformed or even with unwanted birthmarks, well, you got chucked on the heap, right? And that was a way to get rid of you. I mean, in certain places, certain times, right? You got, because nobody wanted to deal with that, and that was weird. And you certainly, those people, those babies, certainly did not have what we would consider human rights at that point. Then there's this great definition of a human as a featherless biped, right? That's a standard definition for humanity back in the day, right? Because, right, all the other animals are four-legged, except for birds. So you have to say, okay, but one without feathers. Which, of course, that doesn't work because lots of things can stand on two legs and they're not necessarily humans. So that's not awesome. As we've progressed in science, we've gotten to this idea of like DNA, right? Determines what is human. But DNA is a little fickle. It's messy, right? There are definitely things that we consider people that have slightly different, right, variations with genetic disorders and so on. Down syndrome, right? That's a very different thing, the whole extra chromosome. And yet I think we still think those are people. Right? And then we look at animals that are like chimpanzees that share like 99 something percentage of DNA with humans. Yeah, we don't think they're human. So, right, DNA gets tricky a little bit. It's hard to know exactly sometimes what is human. And then if we get something right, and we can't go with like rational, like, well, humans think, right? But not all of us do, right? Sometimes people are born, well, I wasn't trying to say that. It's true that not all of us do, but some of us simply aren't capable, right, for whatever reason, due to trauma and or birth defects, to think. And yet, I think we still think of them as people, right? I mean, that's the whole debate about euthanasia, right? If there's a person who's been in a horrible accident and whose brain isn't working anymore, right, what do we do? Well, we have to talk about it because we still consider them people. We can't just say, oh, well, and, chuck them in the hazardous waste and move on, right? They're still people, and so they still have rights, and so we still have to make sure that we're addressing those correctly, right? So it's a complicated to figure out. I mean, it seems like an obvious thing. Well, humans have the rights, but what is a human is not always an easy question to answer. And so there's that, right? Just to already throw in some challenges to this theory. But there are also other rights that we get, right? That we have, that everybody in this room has. Everybody in this room has certain rights that are not by virtue, do not come to you by virtue of your being human, but come to you from political or legal bodies that establish these rights with the goal of creating the best possible society. I put the word "best" there in quotation marks because obviously we can all have different ideas of what it is that makes society good, right? And that's kind of up to us each to determine. I've seen descriptions of this where it's the happiest possible society, but is that really what we're aiming for? Most productive possible society. Sure, if you're a capitalist, that's maybe what you're aiming for, a freest possible society. Well, right. So this best is really sort of a placeholder for whatever the society is really aiming at. And it can depend a lot. But the idea is that we all have certain legal rights that are given to us by the government. Okay. So if I'm continuing down here, so I've kind of gotten into our who has moral rights idea here, and I was talking about personhood and what it means to be a person or a human. And so I've got some criteria here that may or may not be the full list. It's hard to know exactly. Again, it's complicated, but it seems to be that a person is a thing that has consciousness, reasoning, self-motivated activity, capacity to communicate, and a concept of self-awareness, which rules out a lot of things that might be human-like: computers, robots, animals, plants, those sorts of things that are alive, right? Obviously, anything that's not alive doesn't count as human, but right, this rules out a lot of the alternative things. Now, this list still has some of the problems that I was talking about a second ago, right? Like a person who is paralyzed, can't move, right? So is that still a human being? Well, yeah, probably, right? So maybe self-motivated activity is, I don't know, right? It's challenging. And of course, consciousness, this is one of my favorite ones. It gets used a lot, but of course, if I'm asleep, I'm not conscious anymore. Have I stopped being human? I hope not, because that means that my wife can beat me in my sleep. But something along the lines of, right, I mean, we can that's a different path of ethics, really a different path of philosophy, sort of the metaphysics of what is a person. I don't think we need to get that deep into it for this class, but it's an interesting question nonetheless. Who is human? And so we get this sort of description: a person acts ethically if his or her actions follow from one or more relevant rights, and unethically if he or she violates another person's rights. That seems to be a fairly general and decent definition of moral rights theory right there. You're acting ethically if your action follows from one or more rights, relevant rights, right? You can't say, right, I'm eating a tomato and saying, haha, I'm fulfilling my right to bear arms, right? That doesn't really, I don't know, I'm eating a tomato with a spoon. But you know what I mean, right? A relevant right, and unethically if you're violating someone else's rights. Other questions about that? Does that seem reasonably straightforward? Okay. What are these rights that I keep talking about? What rights are there? Well, you've almost certainly heard of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, right? That's a classic from Thomas Jefferson himself. But there's probably more than that. First of all, pursuit of happiness. Well, that's tricky. All right. Why, Patrick?
Because then that definition was not. If you follow the actually what pursuit of land.
It could certainly be interpreted that way. Yeah, absolutely. Happiness, well, and that's always the problem with things that are 200 years old, right? The language changes, and we're going to come back to talk about that in a little while. Yep. Yeah, and that's important, right? The idea, both, there are two different ways of looking at that. One, happiness is subjective, right? So I have the right to pursue happiness, but like maybe that means I have the right to stick thumbtacks in my eyeballs because that makes me happy, right? That's a really weird thing, but okay. Should people have the right to stick thumbtacks in their eyeballs? Maybe, but should people be allowed to drive without wearing seatbelts? Right? It's kind of going back to that discussion that we had a couple of weeks ago. Right? Do I have a right to endanger myself because it makes me happy? I don't know. And then the second thing is, right, sometimes making happy, like it will make me happy to steal Patrick's Oreos and eat them, right? So do I have a right to do that because I have a right to pursuit of happiness? No, presumably not. Because, what's that? I wouldn't be happy for. I only got one left. I thought you were going to say I wouldn't be very happy because you'd break my fingers or something. Okay. Oh wow, that's nice. I'm gonna remember that. So happiness usually goes away as a right when we start talking about fundamental rights, and it's usually replaced by property, which is in fact what, as Patrick said, a lot of what Thomas Jefferson meant when he said happiness, the pursuit of property. So we have a right to life, we have a right to liberty, we have a right to property. So, and it's worth talking about these things pretty carefully because anytime you define something or you just throw out one word, we've got to be really careful about what we mean by that one word. So life is easy. What do we mean by we have a right to life? Sure, you have a right to be alive, right? You have a right to be alive. And if anybody were to sort of violate that right, that would be unethical. If someone were to come along and deprive you of your life, then yes, that seems like a pretty straightforward, not ethical sort of thing. What do we mean by the right to liberty? Freedom, sure. What do we mean by freedom here, though? Freedom to do what you want? It's a song, right? What? As long as it doesn't endanger anybody else? Well, maybe. That's not what we're talking about here, though. Yeah, we have to be careful about freedom. Freedom is a really broad word. So is liberty to a certain extent, but it's more sort of, liberty is a little bit more defined than freedom. Well, so that's freedom, right? I have freedom. When you say I have freedom, I can choose Coke over Pepsi. I can choose Domino's instead of Papa John's, right? That's freedom. We mean liberty here in a pretty narrow, basic, formal definition. What is the most basic sense of freedom? The ability to move about, yeah, right? That you cannot be trapped in a place against your will, right? Even if the person doesn't kill you, holding you in a spot against your will is not okay, right? We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about that. But we're going to talk about that, I promise. Yeah, we're going to talk about it because that also applies to life, right? The government kills people, all right? And so, yeah. What? What about bad cheese? Government cheese. Sure. And then they give you bad cheese, and then they chop you up and put you in the McDonald's, and then it's Soylent Green is made of people. Naturally, with the rat milk, right? It's a Simpsons episode where they find out that the elementary school milk is actually rat milk. Anyway, no, Simpsons episode. I mean, I don't know. Maybe it is, but okay, we're getting off track. But it's worth pointing out that you shouldn't drink milk. You're a grown-up. Grown-ups shouldn't drink milk because you're a grown-up. children drink milk, and then when you grow up, you stop drinking milk. Oh, nice. Oh, well done. Okay. All right. Off track. So, right to life, right to liberty, right? Literally, freedom to move about. That's what liberty is talking about here. And a right to property. A right to what does that mean if you have a right to property? A right to own stuff? What? To be a lawyer? Oh, to own. Well, not just land, right? When we think of property, we think of like your house is your property. But by property here, we mean anything. Sure. Yeah. I mean, I don't own any farm animals, but sure. But even today, right? The right to property, tools, TVs, cars, right? Clothes, all of that. The right to own all those things. Because if somebody is violating your right to your property, what are they doing? And they're stealing it from you, presumably, right? They're stealing your property, and that seems to be not okay, right? So we see what we're doing here in a lot of ways is we're getting back to these same sort of basic not okay behaviors, right? Thou shalt nots, right? Don't violate my right to life. Don't violate my right to liberty. Don't violate my right to property. You'll notice I've hopped over two of them because those are not like the most fundamental things, right? When we talk about Jefferson and life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, these other two, well-being and privacy, are not included on that list, and maybe intentionally. Certainly neither of those rights is posted anywhere explicitly, like in the Constitution of the United States or anything like that. In fact, the right to privacy is one of those things that everybody kind of talks about. Oh, you violated my privacy, my right to being does not exist. There is no such thing legally written down anywhere as a right to privacy. Now, judges have sort of taken some things like the Second Amendment, the Fourth Amendment and the Fifth Amendments, and sort of said, well, right, you have a right not to have your house illegally, not to have your right searched, not to have people living in your house if you don't want them to. You have a right to not to have to testify against yourself, to have to like admit to things that you've done, right? So there's sort of an understood sense of what privacy is that comes out of that. But technically, there is no such thing as a right to privacy in the Constitution or the Bill of Rights. But I think a lot of people think that that is something that we do have, right? That no one is allowed to like broadcast your most embarrassing secrets, or your bank account number, or photos of you in the nude, for example, those sorts of things, right? Those are all things that are yours, and that you that can't be taken from you. It shouldn't be. That it would be an unethical action to violate your privacy, right? If I were to figure out your computer password and then go through all of your files, whether or not I took anything from you or whatever, that would be, many people would consider that a violation of my rights. Your rights, rather, right? Your rights. Maybe. Certainly, it's not as obvious as the other three that I talked about, but it's possible. Another big one is the right to well-being. What's the difference between? I mean, what do I mean by the right to well-being? Being healthy, sure, right? Right. I mean, you could argue when we're talking about the right to life, right? If I am poisoning you, right, but with just enough, I'm putting just a little bit of bleach in your dinner every day, right? Just enough to like make you really sick, but not kill you. Am I violating your rights? Yeah, probably. So there you go. Thanks for that. So what you're saying, I think, is be careful of your wife. That's right, gentlemen. So we've got these sort of five. So you have a right to not just not be killed, but a right to not be harmed, damaged, injured, made sick, intentionally, all of those sorts of things, right? And we can look at examples of these things being changed all the time or being violated all the time. These are pretty frequently violated rights, and generally we tend to think that people are doing things wrong. Flint, Michigan is a great example of the well-being right, right? Not a whole lot of people have, I'm not sure any people in Flint have died, right? We all know the deal in Flint with the water, lead in the pipes and so on because they were trying to save money. Not a whole lot of people there have died. I'm not sure anybody's died, but certainly a lot of people have gotten sick. And so this idea that those people's rights have been infringed upon by the government because of its not just incompetence, but actual like intentional decisions that led to this sort of thing. That seems to be a good example of the violation of this right. What do we think about this list? These are just basic rights. These are, by the way, all going to fall under the category of, I think, and maybe you'll disagree with me, but I think these are all going to follow under the category of human rights. These rights are rights that you have by virtue of being human beings. These are not rights that were given to you by any government or legal body or anything like that. In fact, right, we could go back. You could imagine going back in time before there were governments, before there was society really, right? Go back to really early pre-civilization. And we imagine a person walking around with, his stone axe and his handmade clothes. And we can imagine that that person had these rights, right, by virtue of being a human being. That it did not, none of this came from, well, hey, let's make a village so that we can, protect each other, and that's where these rights came from. These were all things that existed prior to there being any sort of culture. Tracy, you're making a face.
I agree with you in your comment that none of them were given to you by government, and as you mentioned, privacy wasn't a right, but it is there are laws now.
Mm-hmm.
And don't know that Stone Age times that privacy was as big as the rest of the books.
Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, privacy, it feels like a more modern issue, right? As people have stuff and secrets and things that they do. But I think the idea is still there in the sense of like, as a human being, you have a certain dignity, right? And you have a right to maintain that dignity. Right? And I think that's where that privacy sort of comes in. You're right that it varies certainly. I mean, some people are just an open book; they don't have anything private, and yet they still have that right in theory. Yeah, Chelsea. What year? They've not been. Right? Thomas Jefferson was the guy who said life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Right? And that was. Yeah, that's about right. 1774. Yeah. Yes, before any of us were born, I hope. Right. So 18th century. Right. That's when a lot of this stuff is being sort of figured out. Right. The French Revolution is around the same time. But nobody's ever written down like, well, that's not true. Someone has recently, the United Nations, and it's one of the things you're going to read for homework, the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, right? And it's long, it's a long list. The United Nations has put together a list of what it considers to be human rights. But for a long time, nobody ever made like a fundamental list of human rights. It's just sort of like, yeah, that seems right. That seems right. And then, well, what about this thing? Well, that falls under the category of well-being or, that sort of thing. So we're trying to get to the most sort of fundamental list that we can. And this seems about right. This seems. You don't think that applies to all humans? It ought to. Well, sure. Absolutely, right? People have had their rights violated. Right now, someone outside is having his or her rights violated. I guarantee it, right? That is a thing that's happening right now somewhere, right? And that's a shame, but that's again not the point, right? That is a descriptive statement, right? We want a normative statement. How ought people to act, right? People ought to respect each other's rights, right? And that's what we're trying to get at. Does anybody So Tracy made a sort of face about privacy, and I can see why. Does anybody have any problems with anything on this list, or does anybody believe that we should add something to this list? That's also part of your homework too, but you might want to start thinking about it now, right? As you're looking at the UN declaration, right? The question is there anything on that list that shouldn't be, or should there be something there that isn't? Like, yeah, so that we're going to get to that when we talk about protections versus entitlements. That's a good thing, right? Food, yeah, right. In order to have life, there are some basic requirements, yes, and for well-being, there are even more basic requirements. So, but we have to talk a little bit about the idea of negative versus positive rights, and so we'll do that in just a second. Yeah, Ms. Tony. It might. Yeah, I don't mean entitlement in the negative way that often gets used today. Yeah. That's a question though. Is that a human right? Like, can we imagine Stone Age guy back in the BC billion walking around with his stone axe saying, "Man, I have a right to an education, by God," or is that something that has come with society? Is that maybe a legal right? I don't know. It's just a question. I don't have an answer to that. Okay, excellent. But for a starting point, at least, are we pretty comfortable with this short list? Okay, cool. And then, right, and I don't have a list of these because it would go on forever. We also have, well, not forever, but we can also list some legal rights that we all possess as members of the United States, right, as citizens of the United States. What are some of those legal rights? The right to pay taxes. That's not so much a right as a responsibility, right? Ooh. Yeah, okay. Sure. Yes, American citizens do have the right to travel in and out of the country, and certainly within the country, right? So we've still got that liberty piece. Sure. What else? I mean, I'm trying to think of things that maybe go away from these five. Okay, sure, right? Free speech, right? In fact, I even put the little Bill of Rights thing here at the top. It doesn't, because of the weird projector thing. They're not all on here, but right there's a little summary of all of the 10 rights that are in the Bill of Rights, in case you don't know all 10, and very few people do, and that's okay. Everybody knows the first one, right? Well, I shouldn't say everybody. In case you don't, right? Freedom of speech, freedom to assemble, freedom of religion, right? That's all in one. Freedom of the press, it's all in one. 2, the right to bear arms. Everybody knows 2. All right, yay, 2. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about that later. And then things get a little weirder, right? Everybody knows the Fifth Amendment because we all watch CSI and PCDFG shows, right? You can't make me. Fifth Amendment says that you can't be forced to self-incriminate. You have the right to say, I'm just not going to answer that question, no matter who asks. That's basically what the Fifth Amendment is. It's not supposed to be, right? It's supposed to be, I'm just not going to answer that question. But, right, the Third Amendment, it prevents you from having to keep soldiers in your house if you don't want to, which is a little bit specific. That's true. Yeah. Fourth Amendment is the one that says you can't your house can't be searched, and you are not liable to randomly being arrested for no good reason. There needs to be probable cause, et cetera, or significant suspicion. We talked about the Fifth. Then things get even weird. Even I'm not 100% sure what the Eighth Amendment is. There are limitations on bail and punishments. What's that? Well, that's the Seventh, right? That's about trial, juries, and so on. Oh, or Sixth, I'm sorry, is the rights of persons on trial for crimes. And then there's also one about civil and a jury, and jury before your peers and that sort of thing. That's all in there. Yeah, I don't either. I don't remember. It's rights. It's rights by the people, and then the 10th is about rights of the state, like separating them. But it's not super important for us right here. We don't need to talk about all the rights. There are more even than appear in the Bill of Rights, right? There are other rights that we consider ourselves to have, and potentially, right? This is where we maybe get into we have a right to an education in the United States, right? Every child has the right to at least through high school to a free education, though not everybody takes advantage of that. That seems to be, yeah, I mean, there's a question about whether that's a legal right or a human right, that right to education. Yeah. Yeah.
But now that it's the norm.
Yeah. Education?
Yeah. Should be a human right at this stage of development because needed to
Do you? I mean, there are people who have, who leave school in middle school or who never go to school who have perfectly good lives in many ways.
Yeah, that's true. But numbers,
Sure. I mean, it depends on your definition of successful life, right? And certainly in other countries around the world, there are people who have almost no access to education and live perfectly happy, lives in that culture, right? Very much so. Although when you read that UN thing, education is on that list. A right to an education is considered a human right by the United Nations. Though there are a lot of things on that United Nations list that I think fall fairly well under the legal rights, right? There's a whole thing about fair trials and so on in there, and I think that's a legal right more than a human right. So we see the difference between human and legal rights, right? There is no, I mean, the freedom of speech thing, for example, it's pretty clear that is not something that like humans just like we're like, we should all be able to say whatever the hell we want, right? That is not just like I am born a human thing, so I get to say whatever I want. The idea of that being, particularly that being political speech and the freedom to speak in a political arena and say what you want without fear of being arrested or whatever, that's what that really is about. And that's clearly a politics thing, right? Freedom of religion, that is clearly a politics thing, right? Where you can't be told what religion to participate in by the government. Right? I mean, that's clearly what that's intended to do. The gun thing, right? That is clearly a protecting you from the government thing, right? That's what most of these rights are, protecting individuals from the government, right? The whole freedom of fair trial thing is intended to protect you from the government. So those are all pretty clearly political things, even though we talk about them as rights. Well, I mean, they are rights, but I want to make sure that because we use the same word rights for both categories of things, I want to make sure that we see that they are different. Yes? Okay with that? Okay. Invading a right versus inflating a right is a really interesting discussion, and this is one where you guys can tell me what you think. But first, I'm going to tell you what I mean by invading a right. Invading a right is where you prevent somebody, right? You infringe somebody's rights. Like I prevent you from speaking publicly, right? Even though that is your politically right, you have a freedom of speech, and the government says you can't do that. That would be invading your right to free speech, whatever the reason is. Inflating a right is saying everybody has a right to speak freely, no matter what they are saying, right? And some people are going to say, well, you've got to control this right, say, to free speech. I'm just using this as an example. You've got to control this right to free speech because sometimes people say things that are dangerous or that are bad for society, right? They're bad for the larger group. When we're talking about consequences, right? When we get to our teleology here, we're talking about that. The consequences of certain speech can be bad for society. And we've seen examples of this not super long ago, right? Charlottesville being a good example, right? Where people were free to say what they wanted. It led to bad results. Some people would say we have to restrict that speech because it's bad for society. So you are in some ways invading that right. You are restricting the right to free speech for the well-being of everyone, not just because you're like, I don't like you, but because it's better for everyone. Versus inflating a right where we say, society be damned, you have a right to say whatever you want, and that might lead to bad stuff for people, but you have that right. And that's inflating the right. You can make arguments, I think, for and against both of those ideas. A lot of people have had discussions about, well, they're both equally bad, right? That you have to find some sort of middle ground. We don't want to invade people's right to free speech, but if it's bad for society, we're going to restrict it some, right? And we have rules like this today, right? The inflammatory speech that leads directly, it's intended to incite violence, that's illegal, even though free speech. Yelling fire in a crowded theater, the classic example, right? That's going to hurt people. I mean, unless there is a fire, then you're allowed to do that, right? But if there's not a fire, right? I can't say anything. It's against the law, right? Those things have been restricted. That kind of free speech has been restricted. So we want to restrict that. But on the other hand, right? We want people to be able to say what they want, and so we let people, right? Even though we really dislike what they're saying, we let people say things because it is their right. And so people say, well, we've got to find that middle. We want people to be able to say what they want to say, but we've got to restrict some things because it's, for the sake of everyone's betterment. How do we feel about that? Does that make sense? Kind of that middle path? What's that? So if we allow people to say whatever they want, that leads to really bad consequences, worse than the alternative. Yeah. So I mean, my question here is one worse than the other? So some people are happy with coming up with a middle ground, but a lot of people aren't okay with that. Without restriction. Without restriction. If I have, for example, if I have a right to bear arms, should that be total freedom to bear arms, or should there be restrictions? And maybe I don't want to get into that discussion yet, though we're going to have it. Freedom of speech is, I think, a more sort of clear-cut, and in some ways not as clear-cut argument. Again, invading the right is restricting it, right? You can't just go out saying anything you want because, right, it can make people angry. It can cause violence and backlash. It could hurt people because you're saying things that are false, and so on. So invading is restricting it. I can't hear you. I said, I guess the one invading. Yes. You think invading is worse. Restricting is worse than letting anybody say anything they want, even if that leads to the second one. So you think it's bad to let people say whatever they want because they're both bad, right? To a certain extent. Neither one of them is ideal. So what, Tyshawn, what were you saying? They're not, but so the question is, are they the same? Are they both equally bad? Or is one worse than the other? Well, but it doesn't matter what they're going to say. The whole point of this right is I can say anything I want. I can get up on a bridge and shout that McDonald's is better than Whole Foods, and that's going to make some people crazy. What? That's ridiculous. But Right. But the point of the right is it doesn't matter what I'm going to say. I'm allowed to say it. And so that invading, right? We get the. I mean, the point of invading is it's got good, like.
I mean, that's why I just think that's why.
So we get into right around the Charlottesville thing, right? There was a whole lot of discussion about the First Amendment and the right to speech, freedom of speech, and how that, and it's still going on, right? What's the other big freedom of speech discussion happening right now? Not related to Charlottesville. The athletes, yeah, right? Kneeling during the national anthem, freedom of speech discussion, and yeah. That they're not standing when the anthem is being played. It's a disrespect to the flag and to the United States and so on. Is the argument that's being? I'm not saying that I feel that way necessarily, but that's the argument. And so, right, the argument. Oh. That's the question. That's the question, right? Should.
Yeah, he thinks this is worse. Like,
yes, right. So the question is invading the rights or infringing rights, right? So which is worse?
Yes.
So what athletes are doing? Are they inflating their rights because?
Well, it depends on who you ask. Right? Depends on who. So some people are going to argue that they are simply exercising their right. Right. And some people think they're taking too far.
Some people think they're
inflating that right.
So not inflating their rights, and then they will be restricting their rights if they don't protect.
Well, the question: people can't inflate their own rights, right? The government or the rule makers are interpreting the right, the legal right, in one way or the other, right? Either we're saying, sure, you have this right with these exceptions, or you have this right with absolutely no exceptions, right? And so the question is either one of those better than the other? In the athlete's case, right, the idea is, sure, you're allowed to protest, but you're not allowed to protest if it violates or if it disrespects the flag or country, right? Because you're also technically, right, there are also questions about like burning the flag and so on. Basketball players they've been told they have to. Yeah. And we have to be careful also, just to take a quick step back. You can be told to do stuff by your employers as much as they want, right? If you're going to work in a place. Right. And you're allowed to say, well, I don't want to work here anymore. Right. Right. So the basketball player, right? The NBA is certainly well within its rights to say, we have a policy where you stand during the playing of the national anthem, and then if LeBron James says I'm going to kneel during the national anthem, then he runs the risk of being fired. Now he's not going to get fired, yeah. So that's a different question. But anyway, where was I? So the question is that right, and so so that's sort of a private issue, right? The company versus with its employees. What we're talking about is a government issue. Does the government have a right? So if we go back to the Charlottesville, that's maybe a more clear example of government influence, right? Does the government have a right to step in, or is it correct to step in and say, hey, you white supremacists, you're not allowed to say these things because it could very easily lead to the kind of violence that it in fact led to? Or does the government have a responsibility to just say, hey, free speech, man, you're allowed to say what you want, and we hope it doesn't lead to violence, but it might, and we get that, but it's worth it for people to be able to have their speech protected. Yep. So in an effort to be enlightened, an enlightened society, we might have to restrict some speech that is the opposite of progressive, right? That is,
Argue the same thing.
what would they argue?
We're going to a progressive society. We feel that this is a progressive society.
Right.
I should be able to say what I want. Y'all should shut up and listen.
That's part of the problem, right? Who decides what is that best society? When people, right? And it's worth noting that, and a friend of mine, he's a lawyer, he's a libertarian, and we disagree about everything. He's an objectivist, right? He believes very much what Ayn Rand believes. So we don't agree about anything. But he did say something really smart the other day. And he's a First Amendment lawyer. He does a lot of cases about free speech and so on. And one of the things he said is you have to, if you're going to give any sort of power to the government, you have to imagine that power in the hands of your worst enemy. Right? Because although you might agree with and support the people who are in power now, in 100 years, 10 years, it could be very different. In 4 years. Yeah, right? So if we grant power, right? And this was a big thing, right? People were willing to let President Obama have a lot of leeway with like drone strikes and deportations and so on. I mean, sure, not everybody, but a lot of people were very comfortable. Like President Obama he's smart. He knows what he's doing. He's a nice guy. Sure, I'm going to trust him to do the right thing. But every power that we granted to him, we are de facto granting to every president who follows. All right? And so when we get in this position of, I totally don't agree with anything that white supremacist says, but if I say he can't say it, then when I want to say something, then I have to assume that the government can come to me and say, no, you can't say that. That's a problem. That's a problem. And this is why, right? This guy, Ronald Dworkin, he has a horrible name, Dworkin. But he's a very, very smart guy, and he does a lot of work with like right theory and so on, and moral right theory. And one of his arguments is that that invading a right is far worse than inflating it. That the possibility of bad consequences happening if we start restricting people's rights, like to free speech or to assembly, right, and that sort of thing, is the results of that are far, far, far worse than letting some jerks have the freedom to say what they want to say. All right, because in the long run, we value that freedom, and it will be important for us down the line. Does that make sense? Do we agree with that, or do we have a pushback there? Yeah, I think it's really easy to. Oh, hold on, Tracy, go. Okay, Tayshaun, go. Oh, okay, Tracy, go. Like what?
Like when you said invading made
Yeah.
But then the same thing you said, even though it may not be them who cause the action, but they are saying they may cause others.
Sure. Yeah. I think, right, and again, so you're saying that like they both lead bad places. They can certainly both lead bad places. Right. Sure.
But I say make sure you know.
I think, but Patrick, do you have a?
But I think what you're saying is that what would I rather choose? Would I rather one group say what they want to say every once in a while, or the whole country from now on being limited to saying what we want to say?
Every once in a while, it wouldn't be no time.
Yeah.
It would be whatever.
But like let's look at North Korea. And we all lived in North Korea, and if you say anything about the government, you're immediately put in jail. They got more people in jail in their country than they're second to
Us.
So do we want that? We want to still be able to have the freedom to say, government, you suck. You know, so if we give the government permission to limit our ability to speak.
Okay, hold on, Chelsea. Then, understand. Go ahead. You don't have to agree with me. Yeah.
Invading
Yes, invading is worse than inflating. But why not? That's not a good enough answer, right? I mean, you bring up a pretty good example, right? We've got these white supremacists who we all agree are like, those guys are assholes. Pardon my French, people on the computer. But then you've also got people who 50 years ago were looking at Martin Luther King Jr. and saying, hey, that guy's inciting violence. He is asking people to rise up and, okay. Remember, he can't, yeah. A person cannot inflate his own rights. They're saying the government inflated. They did not put restrictions. I mean, inflating sounds like a thing that we do, like we're pumping up and expanding it. But what I'm saying is they did not put restrictions on his rights, at least in theory. And in reality, right, there were. But yeah. No. Well, not. No, they weren't putting restrictions, right? They let. Yes. Sure. There were all sorts of bad people doing bad things. Right.
So if you look at a real life equation, Black Panther Party, it was legal for people to carry guns in the state. When they started coming in there doing that, they were like, okay, no, we need to change this law. They invaded the right. So, but you can make the argument that it's been inflated again, except not the state house.
Right, sure. The idea, yes. The idea that, and maybe inflating is just a bad word. I didn't make this phrase up, but as we're talking it through, I think it's causing a little confusion because. Right. It's not a system of like making the right bigger. It's just not restricting it in any way, right? In any way, and that's what's important, right? Like the idea of total freedom to express or to enjoy or exercise that right, right?
Freedom and invading is
restriction. That's right. Inflating is freedom. Invading is restriction. And more often than not, right? When we have this conversation, people are like, "Boo, invading," because we worry about that. We worry about. I mean, the MLK versus the white supremacists, right? That's a fairly good balancing thing, right? We want people, we can't just pick and choose the people that we agree with to give them. Well, remember, the government is not. Yeah.
We technically, if they fired them, they're violating, but
they could make an argument, right? If I were a football player and I were fired for that, I could make an argument in a civil case that I was fired wrongfully. But that's not a crime, right? And I could maybe sue them for some money, right? Because that was like not cool. But that's also why they don't do that, right? They let Colin Kaepernick's contract run out and then just nobody hired him again. Right? So that's right. There are ways to get around that, but it's not technically the government restricting anybody. The police have not shown up and said, "Hey, you need to stand up," and while the national anthem is being played, the government is very clear that you don't have to pray or do the pledge, and you don't have to, put your hand on your heart when the song plays. Like the government's very clear. You can do whatever you want during the national anthem. This is just people. Well, and I should say Donald Trump and people who are upset about the way they're acting, and some owners, but not all, right? There's a whole bunch of things there, right? So it's important that we distinguish government from private enterprise. private companies. When we're talking about all of these rights, right? Because we're talking about legal rights. These are they're given to us by the government or by laws that have established these rights and that are not violating them. Does that make sense? Certainly, and I think actually it would be much easier. Like it would be a much easier discussion if the cops showed up and said you have to stand up during the pledge or the anthem. Everybody would freak out, right? Even the people who are right now all like boo athletes, they would freak out and say no, that's not okay, right? Because legally, right, we have these rights to express ourselves, even if that expression is just being silent, right? We have that right. So, just to sum up, invading freedom of speech, boo. Inflating freedom of speech, yay, right? No restrictions on freedom of speech, even if we don't agree with what people are saying. We understand the value of allowing them to say it. But we like that. Remember Don Imus? Do you remember does anybody remember the Don Imus thing? This is maybe 8 years ago. Yeah, he was talking about the basketball players at Rutgers University, the women basketball players, and he used derogatory terms. I think he called them nappy-headed or something. He got fired, and everybody around the world was like, "Yay!" Right? Because he was a jerk, and the people who employed him were allowed to say, "Whoa, you're a jerk," or "We don't want to be associated with that," and so you're fired. And that's okay, right? We have to be careful is that we don't just start applying all of these things to just the things we like. Yeah. Right? It's the classic, I disagree with you, but I hate what you say, but I will fight to the death to defend your right to say it, that sort of thing. If these things are truly rights, then we have to be willing to defend them. Chelsea. Okay. All right. Well, maybe I take I'm gonna restate what you said, but maybe in a slightly less litigious way, right? And that's that your other rights do come into play, and that's important, right? If I am if I am Martin Luther King Jr. and I am giving a speech that people don't like, and that leads to violence and them attacking me, then now I've got recourse, right? They've attacked they've infringed upon my right to well-being, right? I can do something about that. Whereas that, right, if I'm restricting if we just say, no, just don't say it at all, it's better for everybody, then that's right for you and these, right? Then that doesn't seem like the way to go, right? There's no point in restricting people's rights because you're worried about other people restricting other rights or violating other rights. That seems weird, right? A little bit. But, and now here's the big but, right? If we move on from the First Amendment to the Second Amendment, things start to get fuzzier, I think. If I invade a right, if I invade the Second Amendment right to bear arms, I'm putting restrictions on your right to have guns. If I inflate that right, I put no restrictions on your right to own guns. And where a second ago we were all like, yeah, invading rights is bad, it doesn't, right? And I'm not going to, you don't have to vote or anything in here. I don't want people to feel like they're under attack. But certainly based on not just the last couple of days, but the last couple dozen years, right? It's pretty, you get a lot of people, particularly in this state, who feel like, whoa, we need restrictions on guns. But why is that right different than the First Amendment right, the freedom of speech right? Is it different? Should it be? Why?
Because of the actual interpretation of that amendment.
Okay, so let's not get into that. Let's pretend let's pretend that the Second Amendment literally says, as it has been interpreted by the Supreme Court, every single person has a personal right to own guns. That's what it is. Well, so it's not that would be too dangerous. It's that is too dangerous. But a lot of people disagree with you, right? Including the Supreme Court. They believe that no, we do have that right, and we're not gonna. We should, in fact, be moving. We do have some restrictions, but we should be moving away from those restrictions the same way that we're trying to move away from restrictions on freedom of speech, on your right to speech, in order to open those rights up. And to follow the same argument I just had, right? It doesn't seem to make sense that we would violate your Second Amendment right because we're concerned about someone violating your rights in some other fashion, right? Like we're not going to tell Martin Luther King he can't talk because we're worried about somebody beating him up, right? In the same way that we're not going to tell you you can't own a gun because we're worried about some guy over there shooting somebody. That's his own problem. That's its own violation of rights. They're unrelated. And so we're going to talk about that too. But they seem to be, right? At least these two, right? They're both Bill of Rights. I mean, sure, one of them comes before the other, but for the most part, right? They're in this document. The gun thing gets its own whole amendment, whereas like freedom of speech is thrown in there with press and assembly and religion. So that actually seems maybe even smaller than the gun thing. That's a bigger deal, right? I mean, there are lots of ways you could argue it. They seem to be roughly equal. Yeah, right.
Yeah, but think about when that was written, how different. They're saying that the weight of what I can say what I want without physically doing damage, well, mentally.
But think of it in terms of, again, full respect for 16. These rights were written. The rights were written as protection against the government. So the freedom of speech was more about you can criticize your government. It just came from England where you can criticize the king. So now they're saying we can criticize our government and not be hung for it or not be shot for it. That's where freedom of speech originated. That's the origination. So you take it further, you say, well, I can say something to him and I don't have to worry about retaliation. Or I might, but he has the right to say the same to me, vice versa. So it's equal.
And you do, right? Sorry, for those on the computer people, right? You may not have heard that because of microphone, but right. There are certainly historical elements that go into the fact that the Bill of Rights is 200 years old, and so they kind of might mean different things, and they come from different sort of histories and so on. And again, I want to really quickly say, and this kind of goes back to what we were talking about a second ago, you do have to worry about repercussions. If you say something nasty to Patrick, you do have to worry about Patrick punching you. Patrick is not the government. Right? He is allowed to respond however he sees fit. Now, right, assault and that's a crime and da-da-da-da. But what we're talking about, the government cannot come here and arrest Tracy for calling Patrick a name. Right? That's what we're talking about with this right. Yes, and that seems to be a pretty important right. Now, that might not be or might be on par with my right to own a gun. Now, my right to own a gun is based around the idea that I have a right to defend myself. And I have a right to possess the tools necessary to defend myself and my family and my property. Remember, I have a right to my property. So it seems to be sort of argued by the government, I have a right to have the tools necessary to do that. And furthermore, talking about protection from the government, right, going back to that First Amendment, right, that whole thing was based on the idea of I have a right to criticize my government. Furthermore, I have a right to defend myself from the government should it be taken over by a 5'6" orange-skinned creep, right? And so I need to have these tools. I have a right to these tools to protect myself and my family and my property. And that seems like a pretty important right. And as soon as we start putting restrictions on that, we start reducing someone's ability to defend him or herself from the government. Chelsea. there are restrictions on the Second Amendment, just like there are restrictions on the First Amendment. You're not actually allowed to use insightful speech that is directly intended to incite violence. You're not allowed to go into public and say, "Hey, everybody, get her." That is illegal, and you can be arrested for that. You're not allowed to do the fire thing in the theater, in the crowded theater, right? There are restrictions on both the First and Second, well, on all the amendments, right? There are restrictions on everybody's rights. The question is, should there be? I don't know. I don't know the right answer. First Amendment seems like, oh no, it should be totally unrestricted. And then we get to the Second Amendment and we're like, oh, I don't know about that one, right? Right. And so maybe we do like certain restrictions. Should I be able to go out and buy a bazooka? Yeah, no, it's hard. It's complicated.
Say you have the right to own this gun, and they know the police are a government. They work for the government.
Oh my God! Why you get out of here? Because
Well,
I'm
then-
scared. I was like,
This is what I mean, like.
It's complicated. Okay, I'm gonna move on because I don't know that we're gonna come up with it soon. Yeah, they're having fun next door. That's right, but we're focused. It seems so. Let's just say this. It seems really hard to argue for extremes, right? To say there should be no restrictions or it should be totally restricted, because those are always going to be, there's always going to be some corner case, right? Whenever we use all or every or none or never, right? Those things tend to get us into trouble. So reasonable restrictions seem, at least initially in theory, right? Finding a middle path seems to be a good idea. We're going to talk about that more next week when we talk about Aristotle. Middle path, big deal for him. But again, remember, any restriction that we allow into play can be used down the line, even against things that we like, right? That we want to have the freedom to have. If we start restricting gun ownership, what's to stop people from restricting car ownership? You're not allowed to have a car that has a mile gas usage, miles per gallon, lower than 30, right? That seems like a reasonable restriction. It's important. It'll protect the planet. It's good for all of us. And yet, if somebody were to come along and take away your car, that maybe, right, for whatever reason, you like your car, but it gets 28 miles to the gallon. Somebody says, nope, can't drive that anymore. That seems weird. That seems like a violation of your right to property. I'm allowed to own the thing I want to own. That's a problem. What if somebody comes along and says, you're not allowed to look at pornography on the computer anymore? That seems like a problem. Not necessarily because everybody in here is like, yay, pornography, but because as soon as somebody comes along and starts telling you what you're allowed to look at and not look at, then we're stuck with that restriction forever, right? And that means that somebody can come along and tell you other things. Oh, you're not allowed to look at that political party's stuff or whatever, right? That seems like a problem. And one of the things that, again, going back to Ayn Rand, one of the things that she liked about this country is nobody's going to do that to you, hopefully. Right? And that's important for this country to be the way it is. So then we get into, how are we doing? Do we want to break or do we just want to power through? Power through. Negative rights. You're welcome to use the restroom whenever you like. Don't tell that to my other kids. They ask and I say no all the time. Because right, if you have to go, just go. And if you can ask, then I'm going to say no because obviously you don't need to. Anyway, protections versus entitlements. What do we mean by a right? And Tracy started to bring this up a second ago. When we talk about a right to, say, life, let's say anybody in here disagree with the idea that we all have a right to life, to live? Okay, so everybody's okay, we're comfortable saying that we have this right to life. Good. But what does that mean, right? The strictest, most basic definition of that is a protection. That means that no one is allowed to violate that right. No one is allowed to come around and kill you. That would be a violation of your right to live. You're protected from that kind of violation. Yes? But you can also make a pretty strong argument for that being an entitlement. I have a right to live. That means that if I get sick, someone has to make me better. If I get hit by a truck, somebody has to take care of me. If I can't afford food, someone has to feed me. Right? And so by entitlement, I mean that I am entitled to life. I am entitled to health. Right? Well, but no, that is not a controversial, that is not a not controversial statement that I just made, right? I'm not saying that's true. I'm saying that some people say that, right? So, but yeah, Ms. Tony, go. Sure. And that's where a fair amount of our tax money goes, right? When we talk, like, if you go to a hospital, if you get hit by a truck and you go to the hospital and you do not have insurance or a wad of cash in your pocket, the hospital will still treat you. They will take care of you, they will patch you up, and they'll send you on your way. Who pays for that? Not quite. So, and we have to remember, does the state have any money? No. Government has no money. Government is zero-sum money-wise. Where does the government get money to spend? From us, right? It all comes back to taxes. Right? So it's not the next person in line. It's all of us, to a certain extent, chipping in, right, a little bit, to help pay for that person. And for each individual person, it's a little bit, right? For each one person who we help, it's cents, if that, maybe a fraction of a cent. But for when you add up all of the people who go to the hospital and get taken care of via Medicaid or whatever, or even just, right, with the government subsidies, it ends up being more money. But for each one person, it's not very much money at all. Right? And in fact, and even when we talk about other entitlements like welfare and food stamps and so on, Medicaid, Medicare, all those, even that really isn't all that much money in the grand scheme of things, right? Like you're paying something like $30 for every $1,000 you make. My math's fuzzy there, but it's not very much. It's not very much. It's not very much. Now, you pay a ton for every tank and fighter jet that we buy. Well, depends on who you ask, right? You could argue that the state exists to a certain extent to protect us from other states. And so we need to have an army and the equipment. We maybe don't need as much army as we have, but that's a different question. My point is that we have some of these entitlements that exist. Even the education thing, right? Is my right to an education a protective right, meaning you can't stop me from getting educated, or is it an entitlement right, meaning I have a right to be educated? And so if I don't have an education, the government has a responsibility to provide me with one. Because those are not the same thing. Not the same thing, right? Right? Because there are places in the country where people are, like, remember Malala Yousafzai, the girl in Pakistan who was shot by the Taliban for trying to go to school, right? Because girls in that country are not allowed to go to school. Their right to an education is not protected. They're not even close to having an entitlement right to education. They're fighting for just a protection where you just can't stop us from getting educated, right? Those are two very different things. Protective rights versus entitlement rights. And so, right, do I have a right to property? This is usually the easiest one. Do I have an entitlement right to property? Am I guaranteed A minimum amount of stuff. No. This is not like as long as you pay for it. This is if I can't pay for it, am I entitled a certain amount of things? Really? Everybody always says no. Everybody always says no, but yeah, right? The government provides low-income housing, subsidized housing, right? Where we're going to help you to have a house because we don't want you to not have a house because then you're living on the street, right? Shelters even, sure. Although those are often charity, but there if there weren't charities, the government probably would have to step up and provide something like that, right? And along with that house, there come things like refrigerators, air conditioners, furniture. That's all property. Well, if you have a refrigerator and no electricity, that's probably not a very good refrigerator. Right? It's just a trap for children. Sorry, that got dark really quickly. Right? And so, right, that we see that in reality, in this country, many of these rights are taken as sort of entitlement rights, that you have not just protective rights, that people can't come and take your property, but that you have a minimum amount of property that you're allowed to demand from the government. How does that feel? Yeah. No? One could argue, right, and I was waiting for maybe one of you to say this, one could argue that that's not really a right to property. What is it a right really to? Yeah, right? Because really what we're saying is we don't care if you have a house, we just don't want you to be sick, right? We're providing you with the minimum requirements to be sort of healthy, and that's going to be a roof over your house, over your head, maybe some clothes, a place to store food so it doesn't go bad, right? Those sorts of things. So really, we're still talking about these entitlement rights to life and well-being, and that usually feels a little bit better than I have a right to you giving me a house, right? But it's all kind of mixed in. It's all still in there to a certain extent. What about what Ms. Tony talked about earlier? The fact that not everybody has these rights, even these basic human rights. Who doesn't have the right to life? Death row inmates. Who doesn't have a right to liberty? Regular inmates. That's right. But not just inmates, right? People who are in house arrest, right? Under house arrest, they're restricted. People who have had restraining orders against them, right? They have a restriction to their right to liberty. There are places they can't go. Sex offenders, and so on, right? All people who have done things to what's that? So they haven't though. They haven't violated their own liberty. They have violated other people's rights. Although that's an interesting, right? My favorite is the drug dealer, right? There's a question there about whether or not he's violated anybody's rights, right? Like if I sell you some drugs, and then like whose rights have I violated there? Back to taxes. Sure, and that's a strong argument. That's good. That's a strong argument against using the person you're selling drugs to as a means to your end, right? You don't care about that person's well-being. You're only using them as a source of revenue, right? And that's a pretty strong argument against selling drugs. However, that's Kant. That's not rights, right? That's not rights theory. But the point is, right? It seems like in our society, you can give up your rights, right? You can commit actions that will allow your rights to be taken from you, right? How do we feel about that? This is really interesting because typically moral rights theory, when I get to this point of the class, everyone's been thinking about, oh, utilitarianism, like that's weird, and Kant, he's hard to understand. But rights, yeah, we get that. We have a right to speech, we have a right to guns, we have a right to religion, and we have a right to live and so on. And usually people are like, yeah, I like this rights thing. This is going to clear everything up for me. But in reality, it isn't super easy. It doesn't make things clear because even those guys who are in prison, have they given up their rights? I mean, all of them? What? No? Somebody said. No. Not even close, right? There are all sorts of things you still can't do to those people, right? You're not allowed to torture people because they're human beings and they have a right. Sure. They have all sorts of rights still. Right, because the idea is, again, that you never stop being, you never stop being a person. And so you can't lose all of your human rights. No matter how despicable the acts are that you have committed, you can't give up all of your rights, right? You can't lose them all. But you can lose some of them, and it's an interesting question as to which ones you can and can't, right? We could get into a whole big long debate about capital punishment. Can a person actually do anything bad enough to lose his or her right to live? Which seems weird, right? We're not allowed to take away your right to, like, cable, but we are allowed to just kill you, right? We're not allowed to torture you, which is bad, but it seems like killing is worse, right? So we can't torture you because that's against your human rights, but we can kill your ass. That seems weird, right? That seems like a, yeah, right? And so, well, I mean, again, there's a whole capital punishment discussion to be had, and maybe we will. In fact, we will on the last class. We will talk about capital punishment. Well, and that's what we're going to do on that last class. On that last class, you can bring whatever you want to bear, right? You can talk about utility or Kant or whatever, but we're not there yet. So clearly, and then when you get out, right? When someone has been in prison and then released, they still have lost some of their rights, right? Like a convicted felon can't vote. That's weird, right? Sure. But you know what they can't buy guns either in some places. In some places they can. And in fact, that's one of my favorite things ever is Marco Rubio, right? The senator from Florida, right? Within a couple months of each other in two different speeches. One of them is like, no, right, convicted felons, they can't vote. They've lost that right. It's been taken from them. And then 2 months later is like, of course convicted felons should be able to buy guns, right? That's a God-given right, right? Like, anyway, so how is there a way that we can wrap our heads around this idea that your human rights can be taken from you, right? I mean, liberty, that's at minimum, right? Just being arrested, even if you haven't actually committed a crime, right? You're walking down the street and you kind of look like the guy who we think committed this crime. We're going to take you, confine you, and put you in a little room and not let you leave for at least a few hours, and maybe much, much longer, right? Depending on trial dates and whatever, right? Even if you never actually did anything wrong. Are we comfortable with that? I know Crystal's not, because she's not comfortable with any of this. I don't know. I only bring this up because it's fun to talk about. It's complicated because if there's a better way to do it, nobody's come up with it yet. Right? Who are they?
They don't break them. They don't break them without being a right. They find loopholes, like the idea that a convicted felon can't vote, can't bear arms.
Yeah.
It's just what you just said. I mean, like you're telling the person things they want to say.
Yep.
But again, it's like the same. It's just they find now and still.
Yeah, it's a weird system. It's a weird system where we have to be willing to let people that we hate say anything they want because it's their right to do so. But we can restrict people's rights when it's convenient. Yeah, when it's simpler than the alternative. Right? That's not a great way to do things, I think. Right? Without any specific criticism here, I'm just saying generally, if you have to kind of ignore the rules in some cases and follow them in others, just because that's the easiest way to do things, that's not a great system. And so it's possible that this whole system of right, where the whole thing is based on rights, doesn't work. It's not good enough. It's not robust enough to address all of the problems. If we're just going to talk about my rights being the way that we determine what's right or wrong, that might not be good enough to figure out what's actually the right thing to do. It might be a framework, it might be a baseline, it might be like a good starting point, but I think maybe we need more than that. Maybe. Because then we get into these ideas of conflicting rights. We're going back to what Tracy mentioned a second ago. Which right wins when they come into conflict? And gun control is a great example. I have a right to own a gun. And everybody else in this room has a right to not be dead. Right? And so when my right to own a gun puts other people in danger, right? And this is a bad example of this room, but like having a kid, I have a right to own a gun, and I also have a right to have a child in my house. And so, but my child could find that gun and kill himself, right? And this is stuff, right? If you have a gun in your house, just a little statistical bit real quick, and I know I'll get to Ms. Tony Farms. If you have a gun in your house, you are 300 times more likely to get shot. And you are 500 times more likely to have a suicide in your house, right? That's facts. That's math, right? So how do we correlate which one's more important? My right to have a gun or the right of everyone else in my house to be alive? When those things conflict, what do we do? Just tell me what were we going to say? No, what?
I was going to say, with the right to have a gun, does it have to be licensed?
Doesn't matter. Wait, are you asking me if?
No, I'm asking you.
Well, so the licensing and so on, those are restrictions that have been added, right? Yeah, in the olden times, right, when they wrote the Second Amendment, there weren't gun licenses. Right? You just owned one. There were tech. And we can do better. We can do the Jean Valjean, right? I have a family, starving, and I need to feed my family. So they have a right to well-being and life, but you have a right to your piece of bread not being stolen. What do we do when those rights come in conflict? What wins? We do this a lot. Which wins? In terms of, right, if we were to rank these rights, we probably could. In fact, we do all the time. Sure.
His rights outweigh the shopkeeper's rights.
Sure. And we consider that, I mean, unless I'm totally misinterpreting that play, that's injustice, right? So we look at that as that was bad that we looked at it the wrong way, that the shopkeeper and the police, right, did things backwards. So our moral inclination seems to be that life outweighs property. Yes. Okay. Yeah.
You are given a penalty, a punishment. You serve that punishment. You do that time, but you're not given all your rights back.
Yeah. Sure. Yes. I agree with you 100% that once you've paid your penalty, then you should go back to zero. But that's not what I'm asking about. Okay. Okay.
The first one, what I did answer first,
yeah.
The well-being of the family absolutely outweighs the property of the child.
Okay. Do we all agree with that? Do we all agree that, like, I mean, another example that's not taken from fiction, right? The Las Vegas stuff that went down a couple days ago. there was a guy who was he was a Marine. I can't remember his name. He's a former Marine, and there were people literally like dying in front of him, and the ambulances are packed, and he sees a truck that has the keys left in it. So he steals a truck, loads people into the back of the truck, and drives them to the hospital. Right? And the guy who owned the truck said, cool, can I just have my keys back someday, right? And like he totally was down with it. He totally was okay with that idea. And I think we all, well, I mean, does anybody have a problem with that? Is there anybody who's like, oh, I can't believe he stole that truck? He did not pay him back for the gas, as far as I know. Yeah. He did. He'd made 3 trips, I think, to back and forth between the hospital and the fairground or the place, and he saved like 30 people, or well, he saved them. He got them to the hospital. Who knows what ended up happening to them? But everybody. So I think, and unless anybody disagrees, that seems like a pretty good indication. Where even if that guy had never gotten his truck back, right? He had to drive it until it fell apart in order to save those people. I think we would, by and large, be pretty comfortable with the idea that those people's lives were more important than the property. Right? And we can go back to the train fork problem, right? You've got one person on the train track, and over here you've got anything with however much money, right? You could have $1 billion worth of Beanie Babies. I don't know. We're gonna crush those Beanie Babies, right? It could be. Yeah. What if it were all the money in the world? Yeah. Sure. It is a different conversation, but only because then you're really making it about life and not about property, right? You're changing the conversation. And it's hard to life versus life. Well, that's a different thing. But if it's life versus property, I think we tend to think life is more important than property. What about life versus well-being? Which one's more important? It just seems like life is more important than well-being. Where does well-being rank with property? Above property, below property, above property? Yes, we're guessing here, right? There's no right answer here. It's just sort of gut feelings right now. Maybe there's a right answer, but I'm not testing you on it. I'm just trying to get gut feelings here about where we are. Liberty, ahead of property, but below well-being. Like, maybe these are actually in a pretty good rank order. Yeah, maybe. But then the question is, and this is going to require a little bit of thought, why? Sorry. It's you have to do this for 2.5 hours once a week. You can do it. Right? The question is, if we rank these in this order, or in any order, whether you agree with this order or not, you can pick any order that you like. Once you've decided that you have to start ranking rights, what is the criterion for doing so? What is the justification for ranking rights? What is it that makes the right to life more important than the right to property, say? So, okay. It doesn't really matter how you rank them. It doesn't really matter. My point is, and it doesn't really matter what your argument is, what your defense is for why life is more important than property. The fact is, the thing that matters is that you have something that you have to rely on that is not moral rights theory. That in order to make moral rights theory work, you have to have a totally separate measuring stick or value system that allows you to rank these. And then what is that? What is that value system? And if there's another value system, why aren't we talking about that instead of moral rights theory? Yeah? So as soon as we have to start looking into something else to figure out how this system works, this system is secondary and not as important as we hoped it was. That's what all the other stuff is, right? All the other stuff we spent this whole class talking about are ways to establish the right answer that maybe moral rights theory doesn't establish, right? In the way that we want it to. Yes? So I know it's got to be really disappointing for you guys to come to class and for me to like, hey, here's this great idea. What do you guys think? And then at the end of class say, here's why you're wrong. Right? I know that's not very exciting, but and I'm not even going to get into the community thing. It's not that big a deal. I don't think. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts or any way that you can salvage moral rights theory? It's a good thing. It's a good system. It's a good system for lots of things, right? It's pretty clear. It allows people to say, hey, that's against my rights. And for you to be able to say, oh, okay, then I shouldn't do it. All right, my rights as a human being. I have human dignity. I have value as a human being. And that means that I have certain spaces that you can't step into. Right? This is my right to life space. This is my right to property space. You can't come in here. These are mine because I'm a human being. That sounds great. And in some ways, that can be really helpful in establishing when somebody has done something wrong. The problem is it doesn't answer everything. There are always going to be issues where we're like, I don't know. And so when we get to like this guns thing, right, we all want there to be an answer to the guns thing. And we can we've only got 20 more minutes or so. And I'm not sure I'm going to hold you that long. But I do want to talk about the guns thing. What do we do about this guns thing, this guns issue? Because clearly we have one, right? There's this recurring thing on Facebook that like, there's no way to prevent this, says people in only country where this sort of thing happens, right? It doesn't happen anywhere else in the world. Only in the United States do we have this kind of gun violence. You know, it's 30,000 people a year killed by guns. That's right. Going back to that statistic about the 300 times and the 500 times, if there were a thing in your house that increased your chance of dying by even a fraction of that, that's CDC statistics. That's yeah. The CDC, Center for Disease Control. But let me finish my sentence, and then you can complain more about my class. The point is, if there were anything else in your house that were as dangerous as a gun, it would be outlawed. It would already be gone, right? They would have said, you can't have, the example that makes me crazy. But the thing that makes me crazy, remember back it was like in the 80s when somebody started putting poison in like Tylenol bottles? And then they started putting those seals, the safety seals, on every single bottle ever, and the kid things. You know how many people put stuff in the Tylenol bottles? One guy, one crazy weirdo, and we have to deal with cotton balls and seals and childproof for the rest of our lives, right? It's ridiculous. Right, you can't get right. And to be fair, there are a lot of people abusing drugs these days. So that's maybe not the best example, but good to know. Good to know. And there's other stuff, right? There are other things another one of those crazy examples, right? You can't stop people from killing people. Say the same people who won't let you take toothpaste on an airplane anymore, right? You can't. Sure. One guy tries to put a bomb in his shoe, and we're taking up our shoes for the rest of our lives. 30,000 people a year, and we can't figure out what to do about guns, right? Well, but it's harder than that, right? I mean, my point. I have a stake in the game. Yeah, right. It's written down, and even though, and a lot of people say, well, right, like Tracy started to say earlier, it's an old amendment. It's being misinterpreted. But even if you can look at that amendment in a way that makes sense, right? I have a right to protect myself. I have a right to protect my home, and there are people out there who will do bad things to me if I don't. I can't always, particularly if I live far from a city, I can't rely on police to be able to arrive in fewer than 15 minutes, right? Well, sure, but certainly if I live outside of a city, right? So, okay. Mhm. Yeah, yeah.
In lieu of a to keep a free standard militia.
Yes.
Because we're worried about the English coming and trying to get their land back.
Yes.
Trying to get their colony back. We have an army. We have police force. That need is no longer there. So now they shifted it.
Maybe. There are certainly places in this country where the police are far away. Okay. And certainly, right? No. And full disclosure, I'm probably farther than you are on this. Okay. I right, because I volunteer for Sandy Hook Promise, and right, I do a lot of stuff with gun stuff because it's important. And I didn't want to turn it into what I think because I hate doing that. But I can also see, even as somebody who feels that way, right? I can see this idea of freedom. I have a right to own these things, both legally written on a piece of paper, and sort of understandably, I have a right to protect myself. Furthermore, we're talking about sort of inflating rights versus invading rights. Why shouldn't I be allowed to buy anything as long as I'm not going to hurt somebody with it? Right? Why shouldn't I be? Because I could hurt somebody with anything I own. Right? I could. My pet rock could be used to crush somebody's head, or I could come up and paper cut the hell out of Patrick, right? But with my newspaper, who knows, right? But as long as I am not using those things to do that, then right? I have a right to property. Shouldn't I be allowed to buy those things? And aren't we? How would they know what? Well, it can't possibly know, in the same way that you don't know that I'm going to hit him with a rock, right? And so if you start telling me I can't own things because you're afraid of what I might do with them, then we start to go down that same path about freedom of speech, where I have to be comfortable now with the government saying, not only can you not buy a gun, you can't buy a knife or a blender or a television. Yep.
You know they're equal. They're equal in rights.
Uh-huh. Yeah, well, but we have to figure out, we can't, right? That's not going to hold water in a court of law. Yeah. Right. Maybe, although even the freedom of speech thing, right? I think I don't know that we're all unanimous on that, right? That I think that we have some even among 10 of us, that we have some, well, I don't know if maybe persons. But as soon as you start putting restrictions.
I know, that's what I mean. So
yeah.
It really boils down to either end up going to another extreme. Exactly.
Yeah, right. If I say, even if it's like you can't have automatic weapons, which by the way you can't, right? You're not allowed to buy automatic weapons in this country because we've started, right? We do have some restrictions, just like you can't buy a bazooka. Then the worry is, okay, if we can't buy automatic weapons, next you're going to tell me I can't buy semi-automatic weapons. The next you're going to tell me I can't buy handguns at all. And then you're going to tell me I can't buy rifles at all. And suddenly I can't buy any gun. And now here you are, the government, telling me what I'm allowed to buy and what I'm not. Well, they already are, right? I mean, they're only, I think it's something like, it varies depending on which study, but it's something like 30% of people in this country own a gun. But those 30% own half of all the guns that are in the world. Like the number of people in this country who own many, many, many guns is really frightening. Like the Las Vegas guy. So they're stocking up. There's no getting around that. And I don't want to get into the whole thing. And then there's also the point, and this is worth remembering, another part of that reasoning behind that right is not just to defend us from the British, right, who are coming, but also to defend us from our own government, should it be taken over by bad people or if they start to go, right? Because remember that we individually aren't very powerful compared to the government. We spend a lot of time relying on the government to do the right thing. And we hope that it will, and it so far mostly has, but not always, and it's getting better in some ways and worse in others. And so we're relying on the government to do a lot of things right, but that doesn't mean that it always will. And one of the things that people who are proponents of the Second Amendment say is that we need to be able to protect ourselves from the very government should things go bad. And so you can see why the government would be in favor of saying, no, you can't have those big guns because someday we might need to come for you, right? And that's just as scary in theory as the you can't say those things because someday we want to take over. We want, right? We want to come for you people. We don't want you to be free to say what you want to say or whatever. Okay? So you can see that argument, maybe. I'm not sure how strong an argument it is, but it's definitely a thing to think about. No, Crystal. Why don't you tell us? Yeah.
And by the way, I love this slide. It's because so they inflate them, right? Everybody can do this.
Yep. No restrictions.
But that is where, first of all, there are actually they just find loopholes to apply this to certain.
Who is they? They apply loopholes to their rules?
Yeah.
Can you give me an example?
Even if they tell someone else to do it.
Can you give me an example?
So everyone can buy guns and stuff.
Almost everyone.
Except who? Like convicts.
Sure.
If you have mental, you ain't right?
And others, right? They're in some places this is already true, but in other places it's they're pushing for, like, if you have a history of domestic violence, right, that you shouldn't be able to buy a gun, right? Because most women who have problems with domestic violence they're more likely to be shot by their spouse. They're more likely to be shot by their spouse by far.
But that's what I mean. Like, you tell, like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
my thing is, well, what if it's that? Because I just feel like
you can look them up. They're out there. And that seems like a good restriction, right? What?
I don't know. I just feel like certain people aren't able to add much that stuff other people for that issue. It's like everyone's really not allowed to do it.
So you're saying it's playing towards a certain demographic?
Yeah, thank you. I was trying to find
Yes. I mean, so what you're getting at fundamentally is that lots of things, when we talk about, like, we the people versus the government, in reality, we aren't we the people. We are made up of a whole bunch of different other groups. And some people have more rights than others. In reality, whether or not, theoretically, all our rights should be equal, but in reality, because of historical practices and so on, we don't. Sure. And there are a whole lot of problems to be fixed. That's absolutely true. And a lot of it has to do with housing, weirdly, right? And it's one of the things that doesn't get a lot of publicity, but a lot of it has to, we talk about Chicago. That's one of the classic, like, responses to gun control. Like, whoa, look at Chicago, right? And the violence, gang violence, and so on. But that, fundamentally, that all goes back to housing practices, right? Forcing people to live in a particular place and discriminating and not allowing them to live in a way that makes sense. And so there being a lot of concentrated poverty and right? So yes, what you're saying is absolutely true, that in reality, this is not a very egalitarian country. But that doesn't change the problem of, like, should people be allowed to buy guns?
No, I know. I'm just saying why we're struggling with which one is worse. It's because I feel like we obviously say in theory, all right, it's worse if the rights was all equal.
I see.
That's what I'm getting at. Like, I get that doesn't change the problem, but
So if we go back to the freedom of speech issue, one could argue that like restricting the speech of the white supremacist is acceptable, maybe, because the target of that speech is a group that is already restricted in so many ways that we might be comfortable saying you're not allowed to say that, but other people are allowed to say other things that don't target that particular demographic or minority group or whatever. Yes?